In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died. He left behind a fortune so large, it reportedly made him the richest man in American history, $105 million. In today's money, that's approximately $2.5 billion. He had steamships, railways, mansions that would make modern billionaires pause. He had everything. But in 1973, exactly 96 years after his death, 120 of his descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University for the very first Vanderbilt family reunion. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Not one of them was a millionaire. Let that land for a moment. The greatest fortune in American history. Gone. In less than a century. And before you say, well, that was a different era, a 2014 study in the Journal of Financial Planning found that 70% of wealthy families lose their fortune by the second generation, and 90% lose it by the third. These aren't ancient statistics. This is happening right now. In every country, every culture, new money is created every generation, and it disappears almost just as fast. And yet, there are families that have held wealth not for decades, not for a century, but for hundreds of years. The Rothschild family, still one of the most powerful financial dynasties on earth, over 2 centuries after Meyer Amschel Rothschild started with a coin dealership in a Frankfurt ghetto. The Rockefellers, now in their 6th generation of wealth, the Medici family of Florence, dominated banking and politics for 300 years. The question is not how they made the money. The question is what kept it. The answer is not better investment products. It is not luck. It is not simply privilege. It is psychology. A specific, learnable, reproducible psychology. A complete operating system for how you think about money, time, risk, relationships, and legacy that old money families have quietly passed down for generations, while everyone else chased the next trend, the next windfall, the next quick return. Today we are going to break that operating system wide open. Stay until the end, because the final psychological pillar is the one that explains why everything else eventually fails without it. Before we go deeper, we need to correct a fundamental misunderstanding. Because most people, even educated, financially aware people, get old money completely wrong. Old money is not simply money that has been around for a long time. Old money is a psychology, a worldview, a complete operating system for how you relate to wealth, time, status, education, risk, relationships, and legacy. Here is the distinction stated simply. New money celebrates its arrival. Old money is quietly embarrassed by people who do. New money counts what it has. Old money counts what it owns. New money buys things. Old money acquires assets. New money seeks validation from external sources. Old money doesn't seek it because it never doubted itself to begin with. In 1899, economist Thorstein Veblen coined a term you need to know: conspicuous consumption. He observed that the newly wealthy, people who had recently acquired money, spent in highly visible ways. The mansion, the carriage, the jewels, all designed to signal status, all designed to say to the world, I have arrived. And here is what Veblen also noticed, that the truly wealthy, the old established families, looked at this behavior with something very close to contempt. Not because they were stingy, not because they didn't know how to enjoy life, but because old money already knows what it is. It doesn't need to tell you. This is not just an attitude. It is a psychological architecture, and understanding it is the key that unlocks everything else we're going to explore today. In 1983, a professor named Paul Fussell wrote a book called Class. a sharp, precise sociological study of American class markers. His observations were controversial, and they were uncomfortable. He noted that the truly upper class in America often dressed the most plainly. Their cars were frequently old, slightly worn, but of obvious quality. Their homes were filled with furniture that looked well used, rather than recently purchased. One detail struck him particularly. The upper class wore clothes with no visible logos, no brand signaling. The logos themselves were coded, an ancient school crest on a blazer button, a subtle club tie, a barely visible initial on a cufflink. The signal was there, but you had to know how to read it, and if you had to be told what it meant, you were not the intended audience. The psychological reason for this is profound, and once you understand it, you will never see wealth the same way again. Old money doesn't perform wealth because it is the reference point. When you are the standard, you don't need to measure yourself against anything. This is not arrogance. It is something quieter and more powerful than arrogance. It is psychological completeness. Pillar 1, the time horizon. Psychology. In the early 1960s, a psychologist named Walter Mischel conducted one of the most famous experiments in behavioral science history at Stanford University. He sat young children, 4 to 6 years old, at a table. On the table was a single marshmallow. The deal was simple. You can eat that marshmallow right now, or you can wait 15 minutes. And if you wait, you'll get 2 marshmallows. Then he left the room. What happened next changed behavioral science. Some children grabbed the marshmallow the moment the door closed. Others lasted 30 seconds. But a small, determined minority waited the full 15 minutes and got their reward. Mischel then followed these children for the next several decades. The children who waited, who demonstrated delayed gratification at age 4, performed dramatically better on academic assessments, built stronger relationships, earned significantly higher incomes, and maintained better physical and mental health well into adulthood. One behavioral quality, observed in a preschooler, predicted life outcomes better than almost anything else researchers had measured. Now here is the critical question. What do old money families understand about time that most people don't? The answer is everything. While the average person thinks about money in terms of months, what is my paycheck? What is my bill? Can I afford this now? Old money thinks in decades, in generations. Consider the mathematics alone. If you invest $10,000 at a 10% annual return, after 10 years, you have $25,937. After 30 years, you have $174,494. After 50 years, you have $1,173,908. The money didn't work harder in the 50-year scenario. The time horizon did. Albert Einstein reportedly called compound interest the 8th wonder of the world. He said those who understand it earn it. Those who don't, pay it. Old money families don't just understand this in the abstract. They have structured their entire culture, their family meetings, their investment philosophies, their conversations around it. Warren Buffett, often labeled new money, is psychologically one of the purest old money thinkers alive. He has lived in the same modest Omaha, Nebraska house since 1958. He bought it for $31,500. He still lives there, despite a net worth exceeding $100 billion. He bought Coca-Cola shares in 1988 and has never sold them. That single position, through patience alone, has returned billions. He famously said, "The The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. Old money families knew this principle long before Buffett articulated it. It is not a modern insight. It is an ancient truth that civilizations of wealth have carried across generations. The Rockefeller family's investment office, Rockefeller Capital Management, still operates under a philosophy that the family patriarch established in the 1870s. 150 years ago, they are still applying principles from a man born in 1839. And here is the crucial element. Old money doesn't just have long-time horizons. It actively reproduces them. Family conversations aren't, "How's the market today?" They're, "What do we want to be true in 20 years?" The language they use, decade scale, generation scale, becomes the psychological water their children swim in. When you grow up speaking in decades, you think in decades. And when you think in decades, every single financial decision you make changes. Pillar 2, the Stealth Wealth Code. Let me tell you about one of the most counterintuitive psychological advantages that old money carries, an advantage that becomes more powerful as the modern world becomes more visible. It is called stealth wealth, and understanding it will permanently alter how you perceive money and power. In 1996, researchers Thomas Stanley and William Danko published a study that genuinely shocked the financial world. The Millionaire Next Door was a comprehensive data-driven study of American millionaires. What they found was so counterintuitive that many publishers initially refused to believe the data. The majority of America's actual millionaires lived in middle-class neighborhoods. They drove ordinary cars, often domestic makes, often several years old. They shopped at ordinary stores. They wore no logos. Meanwhile, many high-income earners, the luxury neighborhoods, the foreign cars, the designer wardrobes, were deeply, dangerously in debt. Stanley and Danko gave the financial world a term that has become famous: big hat, no cattle. All the appearance of wealth, none of the actual substance. Stanley and Danko identified two profiles: the prodigious accumulator of wealth, who built and held real financial net worth, often completely invisible to the outside world, and the under-accumulator of wealth, who spent aggressively on everything that made them look wealthy, and quietly had almost nothing. Guess which profile old money families fit? The PAW every single time. Not because they were miserly, not because they didn't appreciate quality, but because they had psychologically divorced the concept of self-worth from displayed wealth long before they had any pressure to do so. And here is why that matters structurally. When you don't need to show it, you don't spend it. When you don't spend it, it compounds. When it compounds, you have real, durable, quiet power. This is the stealth wealth cycle. Old money has been running it for centuries. There is a deeper psychological reason behind this behavior. It is not just financial. Displaying wealth is, at its core, an act of seeking external validation. When you drive the visible car, wear the visible watch, post the visible holiday, you are implicitly asking the world to confirm, am I enough? Do I count? That is a form of psychological need. And need, in any negotiation, any relationship, any power dynamic, is a measurable weakness. Old money does not seek your confirmation. It does not need your confirmation, because it was never uncertain about its position. That psychological certainty, that quiet, unshakable sense of belonging, is perhaps more valuable than any specific financial asset on the family balance sheet. It allows them to negotiate from stillness, to refuse deals that most people would take out of fear, to say no to things that feel urgent but aren't strategic. Silence is not just aesthetics for old money. Silence is leverage. Pillar 3. Loss aversion mastery. In the 1970s, two Israeli-American psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, began a collaboration that would produce one of the most important discoveries in the history of economic science. Their work, which Kahneman would eventually accept the Nobel Prize in Economics for in 2002, revealed something deeply unsettling about human psychology. We are not the rational economic decision-makers we believe ourselves to be. Here is the core finding. Psychologically speaking, losing $100 feels almost 2 to 2.5 times more painful than gaining $100 feels pleasurable. This is not a personal failing. It is not a character flaw. It is a hardwired feature of the human brain, what Kahneman and Tversky called loss aversion, a central pillar of their prospect theory. In evolutionary terms, it makes perfect sense. When our ancestors lived in environments of genuine scarcity, a loss of resources could be fatal. A gain was pleasant, but not survival critical, so the brain evolved to weight losses disproportionately to keep us alive. But in a modern financial environment, this ancient survival mechanism destroys wealth systematically. Consider 2008, the global financial crisis. The S&P 500 dropped over 50% from its peak. Media was apocalyptic. Fear was everywhere. And ordinary investors, driven by the pain of watching their portfolio shrink, sold. They locked in their losses. They ran. But the individuals, institutions, and families who had mastered their loss aversion response did something counterintuitive. They bought. Warren Buffett wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in October 2008 titled "Buy American I Am." While everyone else panicked, he was methodically purchasing companies at once-in-a-generation discounts. Old money families that had held cash and real assets for years, not out of fear, but out of patience, deployed capital at the precise moment that crowd psychology drove everyone else out of the market. They did not feel less fear than others. They had simply built systems, psychological and structural, that placed distance between the emotion and the action. Old money masters loss aversion in two concrete ways, and both are learnable. First, they reframe time horizons. Loss aversion is most powerful when we are thinking in the short term. I am losing money right now triggers panic. But when your mental time horizon spans 30 years, when a market drop is, in your psychological model, simply a fluctuation in a long story, the emotional weight of that specific moment decreases dramatically. Old money trains its heirs to think in decades by literally speaking in decades. Family conversations aren't, "How is the market today?" They are, "What do we want to be true in 20 years?" The language shapes the psychology, and the psychology determines the decision. Second, they separate identity from portfolio value. When your sense of self-worth is tied to your current net worth number, as it so often is for those who are newer to wealth, a drop in portfolio value is psychologically equivalent to a drop in personal value. That equation creates panic. Old money separates these completely. The number fluctuates. The family doesn't. The legacy doesn't. The identity doesn't. When you know who you are independent of what your accounts say, you can make decisions that serve your future self instead of soothing your present fear. Pillar 4. Network architecture. There is a concept in economics called social capital. It refers to the networks, relationships, and norms of trust that enable people to access resources, opportunities, and power. Old money doesn't just have social capital. Old money is social capital. Legacy admissions to elite universities, a policy that generates controversy every admission cycle, are not, as popular opinion assumes, simply about sentimental tradition or institutional favoritism. They are an investment in network continuity. When a family name opens a door at Harvard, they are not primarily acquiring an education. They are entering a living network of future senators, chief executives, central bank governors, and Supreme Court justices. The classroom is secondary. The conversation after class with the person who will one day govern a country, that is the asset. Old money families have understood this for centuries. The education is the network. The network is the opportunity. The opportunity is the wealth. And the wealth funds the next generation's education, which rebuilds the network. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of extraordinary power. Robert Cialdini, the psychologist whose research on influence and persuasion has shaped modern marketing, identified one of the most powerful forces in human decision-making: social proof. We trust people our trusted people trust. We do business with people our community endorses. We hire people our network vouches for. Old money has engineered this social proof dynamic into permanent physical infrastructure. Private clubs are not social indulgences. They are trust networks with financial consequences. When a business opportunity arrives, old money doesn't just evaluate the idea. They evaluate the person bringing it through the network. Do we know them? Who do they know? Who vouches for them? This closed-loop evaluation system filters out risk in ways that no due diligence report can fully replicate. Because trust built over decades of shared community is a form of signal that cannot be faked. Here is the piece that applies to everyone watching this, regardless of your current position. Network architecture is buildable from any starting point. Old money builds through institutional infrastructure, universities, clubs, boards. But the underlying principle is entirely transferable. Identify the communities of your aspirational future. Invest in becoming a genuine value-adding member of those communities long before you need anything from them. Social capital is the only form of compound interest that does not require money to begin accumulating. The great families did not build their networks in moments of need. They built them through decades of genuine contribution, consistent presence, and trustworthy behavior. The network was built in ordinary moments, not transactional ones. You can begin that process today with whatever circle you have. The architecture starts with showing up, reliably, and giving more than you take. Pillar 5, education as identity. Here is one of the most misunderstood distinctions between old money psychology and new money psychology, and it might be the one that surprises you the most. Old money is obsessed with education, genuinely, almost compulsively so, but not in the way most people think about education. For most people, particularly first-generation wealth builders, education is a credential. A degree is a ticket. You study, you earn the certificate, you trade the certificate for the job for the income. The degree is the destination. For old money families, the degree is barely the beginning. In fact, the formal university education is almost incidental to the real education they are acquiring. What old money invests in is the capacity to think, the ability to analyze complex problems, to understand systems, to read people and situations with precision, to communicate with clarity, to make decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty. And crucially, this investment in thinking never ends. It has no graduation date. John D. Rockefeller contributed over $35 million of his personal fortune to found and fund the University of Chicago alone. He supported medical research that helped eliminate diseases. He funded public health infrastructure across multiple continents. This is not coincidental generosity. This is strategic. Old money understands that controlling and funding knowledge institutions is a form of long-term influence that no government, no market crash, and no economic crisis can easily erase. The Carnegies, the Mellons, the Fords, the Gateses, all old money, or nouveau old money, investors in the infrastructure of knowledge. Why? Because knowledge is the only asset that compounds simultaneously in the mind and in the world. A person who thinks better makes better decisions. Better decisions compound over a lifetime and over generations. Here is the element that is accessible to everyone. Old money families don't only invest in formal education. They invest in the culture of education within the home. Research by sociologist Annette Lareau found significant differences in how wealthy families versus working-class families structured children's learning, not just in what schools they attended, but in how conversations at home were conducted. In old money families, dinner table conversations cover history, economics, philosophy, current events, ethical dilemmas. Children grow up hearing the language and frameworks of wealth, of how markets work, how institutions function, how people make decisions, long before they are old enough to manage money themselves. By the time they inherit anything, the vocabulary of wealth is as natural as breathing. You may not have had that dinner table, but you can create it for yourself and for the next generation you're raising. One serious book per month, one substantive conversation per week, one honest mentor in your life. The compound interest of education starts accruing from the first page of the first book. Pillar 6, the ownership psychology. Never sell the land. It is one of the most consistent instructions passed down through old money families across every culture and continent: Filipino, European, American, East Asian, African. The specific asset varies by geography. The instruction does not. Why? What is it about ownership, particularly of physical, tangible assets, that old money protects so ferociously? At the foundation of old money psychology is a distinction between two types of people that shapes every financial decision they make: those who sell their time and those who own assets. An employee, no matter how well compensated, is ultimately selling a finite, non-renewable resource: their hours. A specialist earns when they work. A professional earns as long as they show up. But the person who owns the building where that specialist works, they earn whether they are asleep or awake, whether they are healthy or sick, whether the economy grows or stumbles. Old money doesn't just understand this distinction intellectually. They are animated by it. They build every financial decision around it. The goal is never to earn more from your time. The goal is to own more things that earn without your time. The legal instruments of old money are not accidental. Trusts, family offices, holding companies, endowments. These structures are not merely tax instruments, though they function brilliantly for that purpose too. They are psychological instruments. A trust is, at its deepest level, a declaration that the family's assets are not personal property to be enjoyed and spent. They are stewardship. They belong, in a very real sense, to descendants who have not yet been born. The Rockefeller Family Trust famously requires consensus among family members before assets can be liquidated. This is not just financial prudence, it is psychological protection against the most dangerous impulse any inheritor can have, treating inherited wealth as a personal windfall rather than a generational responsibility. When you have to get your family's agreement to sell something your great-grandmother bought, selling it stops feeling like a personal choice and starts feeling like a historical act. And most people, when pressed, don't want to be the one who broke the chain. That psychological friction is worth more than any legal restriction. Real estate, specifically, occupies a special place in the old money ownership psychology. And the reason is not purely financial. When you own land, when your family has owned land for multiple generations, it creates a physical, tangible anchor to the concept of wealth. You can stand on it. You can walk it. You can show it to your children. You can say, "This belongs to us. This has been ours since before your grandparents were born." That experience of ownership is qualitatively different from a brokerage account number on a screen. Numbers are abstract. Land is real. Human beings protect what they can physically relate to. They protect what carries memory and identity. Old money has always known, perhaps intuitively, perhaps through hard experience, that the most durable form of wealth protection is psychological attachment. When the land is also the family story, it becomes very hard to sell. And that resistance, generation after generation, is how dynasties are built. Pillar 7. Emotional financial discipline. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the world. Emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 AD. Supreme commander of the most formidable military in existence. Master of an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. And every morning before he addressed the affairs of that empire, he sat alone with a journal, not to plan, not to strategize, not to issue orders, to discipline his own mind. What we now call meditations, that private journal, never intended for publication, is perhaps the most honest document of psychological self-governance ever written. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Marcus Aurelius was, without knowing it, articulating the foundational psychological principle of old money. Emotional discipline is the master skill from which all financial skill flows. Modern behavioral economics has now confirmed in laboratory conditions what old money families knew from lived experience across centuries. Emotion is the enemy of financial decision-making. Research from Carnegie Mellon University found something extraordinary. People with damage to the neural region governing emotion, people who literally could not feel fear or excitement, consistently made better financial decisions than neurotypical subjects. They held winning positions longer. They didn't panic sell in downturns. They didn't get swept up in euphoria during bull markets. The absence of emotional reactivity was, in financial outcomes, an advantage. You obviously cannot and should not eliminate emotion from your life. But you can build systems that place distance between the emotion and the consequential action. Old money built those systems over generations, and the systems, once built, become self-reinforcing culture. Old money families pass down emotional discipline not through lectures, but through stories. Every old money family has the story. The ancestor who held through the Great Depression. The grandfather who didn't sell during the oil crisis. The grandmother who calmly purchased when everyone around her was liquidating. The uncle who turned down a frantic acquisition offer and watched the company triple in value 2 years later. These stories are not just family lore. They are psychological programming. They are evidence embedded in the family's identity that patience is not passive. It is a form of strategic aggression. That we, as a family, are the people who hold when others break. That panic is a failure, and discipline is an inheritance. When you are in crisis, and you know that your grandmother held, and her grandmother held before her, selling feels less like a financial decision and more like a betrayal of something larger than yourself. That is an extraordinarily powerful psychological restraint, and it costs nothing to create. When the medieval craftsmen began building the great cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, the Canterbury Cathedral, they understood something remarkable. They would never see them finished. A great cathedral took 50, 100, sometimes 200 years to complete. The mason who set the first stone knew with certainty that he would die long before the last spire was crowned. They built anyway, because they understood, at a level that was visceral and real, that they were not building for themselves. They were building for a future they could envision, but would never inhabit. This understanding, the willingness to sacrifice present comfort for future permanence, is perhaps the defining psychological characteristic of every great old money family in history. It is what we call the legacy operating system. The most sophisticated old money families maintain what is known as a family constitution, a formal document that articulates not just the rules for managing shared wealth, but the values, mission, and purpose of the family as an institution. This is not a legal document. It is a psychological one. It answers the questions that break wealth from generation to generation when left unanswered. What is this family for? What do we believe? What obligations does our wealth create? What kind of people do we intend our children to become? What is the condition of our trust in each other? When children grow up with a clearly articulated family identity, an answer to who are we that exists independently of net worth, they do not experience inherited wealth as a windfall to be enjoyed. They experience it as a responsibility to be honored, and there is a world of psychological difference between a person who received money and a person who received a mission. John D. Rockefeller, despite being the most hated man in America at the height of his power, the target of antitrust legislation and public fury, made a decision in the final decades of his life that became, perhaps, his most powerful financial move. He gave away $540 million during his lifetime. In today's terms, that is approximately $17 billion. He funded universities, medical research, public health infrastructure, civic institutions. Was this purely generosity? Partly, yes, but consider the strategic genius beneath the surface. By embedding the Rockefeller name into knowledge, health, and education, into institutions that genuinely improved human lives, he accomplished something no business success could have achieved. He converted the most despised man in America into a dynasty with moral authority. The Rockefeller name in 2025 is not primarily associated with monopoly and exploitation. It is associated with medicine, education, and human flourishing. He didn't just build a financial legacy, he built a cultural one. And cultural legacies outlast financial ones by centuries. The Vanderbilt autopsy. What happens without the psychology? Let us return now to where we began. The Vanderbilts had more money than almost any family in human history. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, was brilliant, strategically ruthless, visionary. He built the New York Central Railroad into an empire and died as the wealthiest man in America. But there is something biographers consistently note about the Commodore. He had no psychological infrastructure for his wealth, no family mission, no trust philosophy, no legacy operating system, no deliberate culture of stealth or discipline, no family constitution, no answer to the question, what is this wealth for? He gave his eldest son, William, $90 million, then the largest inheritance in history, and said essentially, here, don't lose it. William doubled it. William was disciplined, focused, gifted. But William's children grew up watching their father accumulate, without understanding the psychology beneath the accumulation. When they inherited, they knew only the comfort of wealth, not the discipline that created it, not the identity that should have protected it. They built mansions. They threw parties that became synonymous with Gilded Age excess. They competed with each other in increasingly elaborate displays of spending. And the mathematics of spending without replacement is terminal. By 1973, when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered at the university that bore their name, the one lasting monument a family member had chosen to fund, not one of them was a millionaire. In less than a century, the greatest fortune in American history, gone. Researchers Roy Williams and Vic Pricer spent decades studying the mechanics of generational wealth failure. Their findings, after interviewing thousands of families who had lost significant wealth across generations, identified three root causes present in 90% of cases. First, the failure to prepare heirs psychologically, not financially. Second, the breakdown of communication and trust within the family. No shared process for decisions, no family council, no collective identity. Third, the absence of a shared vision of purpose. No answer to the question, what is this wealth for? Every single one of these causes is psychological, not market-related, not tax-related, not investment-related, psychological. The Vanderbilts had the money. They simply never built the mind around the money. And the mind, it turns out, is the only thing that actually holds wealth across time. How you adopt the old money psychology. 8 shifts starting today. Now, let us talk about you. You may not have been born into a family with trust structures and private clubs and generations of deliberate psychological programming. But hear this clearly. The psychology we have examined today is not genetic. It is not inherited at birth. It is learned, practiced, rehearsed, and passed on. Every old money family started somewhere. The Rothschilds began in a ghetto. Carnegie began as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory earning $1.20 a week. Rockefeller started as an assistant bookkeeper at 16. The psychology came before the money, not after it, which means every principle we've examined today is available to you, starting right now. Here is your framework. Shift 1. Lengthen your time horizon. For every major financial decision, ask, how does this look in 30 years? Not next month, not next year, 30 years. Train your brain into generational thinking by asking generational questions. Shift 2. Practice strategic invisibility. Stop performing wealth you don't yet have. Stop spending to maintain an image for an audience that doesn't care as much as you think. Every unit of currency you save from performance becomes a seed you can deploy into something real. Shift 3. Study your own loss. Aversion. Learn to recognize the emotion that arises when your portfolio drops or your business has a bad month. Name it, observe it, then make your decision from outside the emotion, not from inside it. This is a practice, not a personality trait. Shift 4. Build network architecture. Deliberately identify the communities of your aspirational future. Show up. Add genuine value. Build real relationships long before you need anything from them. Start with one person who operates at the level you aspire to. Invest in that relationship consistently. Shift 5. Make education your identity. One serious book per month. One honest mentor per year. One learning commitment that never ends. Become the person who is known, by yourself and others, as someone who is always growing. This is your personal family library. Shift 6. Shift from earning to owning. Begin converting earned income into owned assets. Start small. A fractional property investment, index funds, a side business with equity upside. The vehicle matters far less than the psychological shift from selling time to owning things that work without you. Shift 7. Define your legacy. In writing, write one paragraph, just one, about what you want to be true about your financial life in 20 years. What you want your children to inherit. Not just money, but psychology, values, capability. Read it quarterly. Let it become the filter through which you make decisions. Shift 8. Create financial culture. At home, if you have a family, a partner, children, siblings, begin talking openly about money, about assets versus liabilities, about patience versus panic, about the difference between buying things and building wealth. The dinner table conversation you create this year is the programming the next generation runs for decades. Let me leave you with this. Wealth is not primarily created by intelligence. There are brilliant people who die poor. Wealth is not primarily created by hard work alone. There are people who work every hour God sends and never accumulate. Lasting generational quiet wealth is created by psychology, by a specific way of thinking about time, about status, about learning, about ownership, about emotion, about legacy. The Vanderbilts had the money and lost the psychology. In one century, the greatest fortune in American history vanished. The Rockefellers had the psychology. 6 generations later, the name still carries weight. You do not have to be born into old money to think like old money. You just have to decide that you are no longer optimizing for now. Start optimizing for forever. If this video shifted something in how you understand wealth and psychology, share it with one person who needs it tonight, and leave a comment below telling me. Which of the 8 psychological shifts are you going to start with? I read every single one. See you in the next one.